Quite some years ago I became interested in undertaking a PhD, and I had what I thought was a reasonable proposal. So I went off to see a highly regarded professor, who's actually not in this room, about my fabulous idea. I was quickly informed that it was, and I quote, a dog, and I was advised to study a senior leader instead, of whom he suggested several. In retrospect, I'm kind of glad that I didn't do either, because both the dog and the suggested senior leaders were all soon covered by other people, and books were published on all of them. I've actually seen some of them up on the slides here today. This experience did not diminish my overall interest in higher research, or the Great War for that matter. It was simply my first insight into what I feel is the crowded nature of Great War scholarship. And returning, something like 15 years later to actually get on with the job, I haven't found it to be any less crowded. There seem to be new books written on just about everything. This afternoon I'd like to do three things. Firstly, I'd like to tell you very briefly about the research that I'm doing under John Connor. Second, in relation to the question of where next, I'll offer an opinion on what I see as some of the challenges in the path ahead. And thirdly, I'll try to reconcile what I mean by the title of differentiation and meaning and why I believe they're important. So first, the sales pitch I made to my initial academic review board. So in November 1918, wherever the picture has gone, after 4 years of war, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent, and the men in the photograph that you see were probably most relieved because they'd survived over 2 years in France and Belgium as soldiers in one of the 5 Australian infantry divisions that served in the British Expeditionary Force. And for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'd have to be pretty good from that distance, but the insignia on their uniforms shows that they were members of the 4th Division, a formation described by Charles Bean as having the least polish but the most numerous war scars of all of the Australian divisions. So the aim of my research is to examine the experience, character and battlefield performance of the 4th Division on the Western Front, and I'm seeking to do this by addressing three questions. What factors shaped their performance? In what ways did the factors contribute to their character and effectiveness, or perhaps vice versa? And how did the division's place as a subordinate coalition element affect its employment and performance? The main vehicle for addressing these questions, perhaps not unsurprisingly, is through case studies on 3 significant actions in which the division fought, and these occurred at Pozio and Moquet Farm in 1916, at Bullecourt in 1917, and at Dernancourt in 1918. So, as you can see, they were pretty busy, and this doesn't get anywhere near the extent of the things they were involved in. This division did not single-handedly win the war. It can, or it did, as can be said for most, if not all, formations, have some interesting characteristics. And so this work is important, at least to me, because unlike the other Australian divisions, relatively little has been written about the 4th as a division. It has no formation level history and has received limited academic coverage, noting that this was prepared a little while ago. There's therefore a gap in the context, that elusive grail that all scholars seek, in the context of a growing historiography of Australian participation in the war, much of which focuses on training, technology and command. Now, it's difficult, of course, even in the context of the centenary, for most people to even begin to imagine the nature of the war. I think we've all at some time been inescapably drawn to think of trenches and mud and immobility. But the more you drill down into the unit level histories in the 4th Division, and I know that it's the same in the other divisions, you find these depictions of constant movement. It's not immobility at all. They are constantly moving. It's almost impossible for people today, I think, to fathom that the 4th Division alone had over 40,000 casualties. That's more people than the population of Bathurst, or Dubbo, or Kalgoorlie. Pick your town. And you can imagine by extrapolation the damage that causes and the loss of that number of people. Yet they continue to function, regenerate and perform. And it's this thing about functioning and regeneration and performance which is of great interest to me, because such examples suggest that the examination of this divisional experience is not only historically important, but it may also offer relevant contemporary insights, because the Australian Army continues to operate as a junior partner in coalition settings. So the experience, character and battlefield performance of the formation may therefore tell us much more than might be imagined in the first glance. So through the research, I hope to identify new insights and knowledge in creating a divisional history scrutinising factors beyond training, technology and command, and discerning issues and problems that can arise in smaller forces subject to the circumstances of the dominant partner. So what have I found? And for our purposes today, I'll limit myself very generically to 3 points. First, there are still nuggets in the creek. I have found myself surprised and occasionally even excited by oh my God moments of realisation that how on earth is this not, or how on earth does this seem not to have been seen or raised before? Second, I've been surprised by what I think is a general lack of understanding of what I call battlefield mechanics. And Malia referred to it as being so epically wrong. How is it that we can get things so epically wrong? I'll come back to this point a little later because I believe it's part of our collective challenge, particularly in relation to land forces. Third, and unfortunately for me, it's my own personal crowded field exhibit A, and that is that someone else is just about to publish a book on the 4th Division that they've spent 10 years working on. Well, what can you say except perhaps bugger? So what happens next? Well, a field being crowded doesn't mean that that's all a bad thing. The upside is that I don't see any shortage of interesting things to pursue. But what I do also see as a great challenge, as a great challenge in Great War scholarship, but what I also see is a great challenge in actually having Great War scholarship mean something when the box has been ticked and the rest of the world moves past it to the next centenary or event, let alone the myriad of other compelling subjects and distractions. So I'm actually not sure what happens next, but as an aspiring Great War scholar, what I do see as very challenging is that we can research and write about all sorts of things, but if we can't differentiate what we find, propose or say, and if we can't make it meaningful and influential through its accuracy, then this field will lose relevance. And I wonder at the extent to which that may already be happening. And I have a few examples of this. A few years ago, and it was within the period of the centenary, I was at a presentation given by none other than Roger Lee, and I was really glad to see him here up the back today, to a military audience about Great War leadership. Now Roger, of course, carried this off very well, as you'd imagine, but I sat there really quite surprised at the reaction he received because he had the temerity to argue to this military audience that British leadership wasn't universally bad and Australian leadership wasn't universally good. And it's by no means the only ADF example that I've seen of what I think shows a somewhat superficial approach to history. Second example, in a recent article, the now Major General Chris Field, I think he actually wrote it this year, so as a Major General, he described his experience attending the United States Marine Corps Command and Staff College and School of Advanced Warfighting in 2000 to 2002. And to quote him, prior to that seminal experience, my education accorded to standard Australian Army officer requirements. I completed infantry and all corps education and training, gained undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. I served in regimental training, peacekeeping and combat appointments, but despite receiving a standard Australian officer education training experience, compared to my USMC peers, in the summer of 2000, I felt intellectually underprepared for the Staff College. In particular, my USMC peers' reading and understanding of military theorists, including Jomini, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, Mao, Mann, Courbet, Thucydides, Douay, Mitchell and Trenchard was far superior to mine. I use these examples to offer the idea that part of the what next for Great War scholarship is to become more involved in officer education, and that another brief article, also recent, November last year, gives further insight into why this suggestion will perhaps become even more pressing in the future. In November last year, a former high school teacher named Jack Emerson suggested that modifications to the Australian national curriculum between 2003 and 2014 had resulted in a reduced focus on Australian military history in secondary schools, and that the depth and breadth of Australian military history taught there had significantly reduced, obviously meaning that young Australians joining the ADF will do so without the same degree of knowledge of their predecessors and will need to be taught. And similarly, of course, it means there will be less people with an interest in entering our field. These are examples of the challenges before us. I'll conclude with an excerpt from a book published 50 years ago because I found it an interesting example of how things change. In October 1967 at Tyne-Cot, Passchendaele was commemorated and the weather was appropriate and reminiscent, nasty and cloudy. Every regiment that lost more than 100 men killed in the battle sent a detachment of 1 officer and 9 men to keep the ground. The most striking party of those keeping the ground consisted of 1 officer and 8 Australians. They detached themselves during the march-in and moving across the cemetery took post guarding the great cross in the centre. The Australians captured the actual ground on which the cemetery now lies. Their selection for this task of honour was typical in the forethought and imagination that characterised all the arrangements. I wonder if anyone here may have attended the 100-year commemoration of Passchendaele at Tyne-Cot. Who held the ground? It wasn't us.